Okay, this lecture is a brief review of Leonardo da Vinci, just a brief introduction, talking a little bit about his training and also some of the works that he produced that are the most famous. So starting off, let's have a look at a work created by his master, a man that he worked with in his workshop. This is Verrocchio, Andrea del Verrocchio. So this is a sculpture that we see of a young woman where we see the body has been cut off kind of halfway. So this is an important clue in terms of how Leonardo is going to change portraiture and how he's going to start to include more of the body, how the body's also going to be facing front, how it's going to be a frontal type of perspective. So we see the woman gazing out towards us, we see her face here, we also see her hands, and hands were actually quite alluring and beautiful in the Renaissance. So we see her hands in full display, and she's holding on to a bouquet of flowers, and the flowers maybe could be associated with a beloved or a lover of some kind. Maybe this was a gift from her lover, and then she's holding it tightly to her chest. So the idea that maybe she's holding her beloved closely towards her. Her hair is tied up. There is some possibility that this is a mistress associated with the Medici court, possibly a mistress of Lorenzo de' Medici, but there's no certain answer on this. So a portrait of a woman, we're not exactly sure which woman this is, but because her hands are on display in this way, this is quite an alluring image, quite beautiful. So we doubt that it's like a well-known noblewoman, because we don't think a noblewoman at this time would have allowed this kind of representation. So again, that is Leonardo's teacher, and Leonardo was a big fan of painting, not sculpture. So it's interesting to know that his master, Verrocchio, was really much more well-known as a sculptor than as a painter. Leonardo will transition into, however, more painting. So here we see an example of his painting. Although he trained in Florence with Verrocchio, when the Medici court are commissioning works and things like that, we do see him head up to Milan, where he thinks he's going to have more opportunity. So he goes up to Milan, and there you have the Duke of Milan. And so the Duke of Milan, he's hoping the Duke of Milan will give him some employment. But one of his projects before he actually is hired on by the Duke is what's known as the Madonna of the Rocks. And this is a piece that was created for a confraternity of the Immaculate Conception at a church called San Francesco Grande in Milan. And this is a relatively complex altarpiece. So you see the altarpiece here with its curved frame, and then you have the rocks in the background, and then you have the figure of the Virgin Mary at center. And with the Immaculate Conception, this was a belief that the Virgin had also been conceived immaculately, or therefore like not through traditional means of conceiving children. So the idea that the Virgin, the mother of Christ, could not have been conceived in a traditional way. So the idea is the Virgin was also very sacred. We see her here at center. We see a figure here praying, and at first people mostly think this is Christ, but in fact this is probably Christ, even though he's lower down, and he's offering a blessing gesture of 2 fingers. And you have an angel kind of presenting and pointing towards the figure here who's praying, probably John the Baptist. So you see an interesting combination of gestures, which would be something that Alberti would like, some of the art theorists at the time, because your eye is constantly moving. For example, you have the blessing of Christ directing your eye towards the praying figure. Also the point of the angel directing your eye towards the praying figure. Then you have the Virgin Mary with her hand over Christ, and then her arm around John the Baptist, or this praying figure. It also has kind of a smoky quality, which tells us about the sfumato, this kind of dramatic chiaroscuro that Leonardo preferred to use. These mountains, although they look kind of frightening and a little spooky, are probably something he saw when he was traveling around northern Italy. There are mountains called the Dolomites, which have this kind of these peaks that are associated with them. Leonardo was also very interested in nature and kind of similarities to northern painting, that is Flemish painting. So it's done in oil in the kind of northern style. You can see all this attention to detail in the natural world. And Leonardo was known for his enjoyment in experimentation, his different types of projects that he worked on, observing the natural world, such as water movement and things like that. So Leonardo was not easy to work with. That's something to keep in mind. And it seems that some kind of legal battle developed over this altarpiece. So he ends up making a copy. And today, this is actually in France. This one ends up in London. But he ends up making a copy. So it seems that something happened with this commission, indicating to us a pattern with Leonardo maybe not really finishing his projects. He seemed to prefer just kind of experimenting and working on his own and working really slowly. So this is a case where we're seeing something where a problem arose. So a work probably created by Leonardo and then also associates, so people in his workshop. You can see it's very similar, same kind of pose, but it's clear that this is John the Baptist. He has an elongated cross. You have halos that are more clearly defined. Lots of the pointing is taken away, so it's clear to know that this is Christ and this is John the Baptist, because that pointing gesture might have confused people. So Leonardo's paintings are not always easy to understand. They have a lot of complexity, and sometimes mystery has been associated with them. But I think through some close observation, following the different gestures, following the emotion, you can figure it out. So finally, he does get hired by the Duke of Milan, and one of his projects is to create a painting for the refectory, or the cafeteria basically, of a monastery that was important for the Duke, and this is Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. And so this is basically, again, where you would eat, and usually you would have a Last Supper scene on one side and a crucifixion scene on the other. So that's what you have here, and we'll focus in on the Last Supper scene, which is the part that Leonardo painted. But the idea is, while you're eating, you're thinking about the Last Supper of Christ before his crucifixion, and then his sacrifice in the crucifixion. Leonardo did this in an experimental technique, so this is a pretty restored view of it, but it's in pretty rough shape. He did it primarily in a fresco secco technique, so primarily dry, so a lot of it chipped off, and it started chipping off almost immediately, so it's very, very quick. You can see the Duke of Milan's arms up on the top, so we know that it's something that he commissioned, that's something that he paid for, and you can see that Christ is very calm at center, and the moment that Leonardo has picked in order to charge it with emotion and drama is the moment when Christ says, "One of you is going to betray me." And so all the figures are reacting to that. So you have figures saying, you know, arguing with each other on this side, this group of three. You have this group of three where one figure is going like, is it I? Another one that's maybe accusing someone and kind of raising his finger up. Another group of three that's kind of our key group of three, and then a final group of three. So the idea is you have kind of chaos surrounding Christ and then a calm Christ right at the center. So this key group of three, you have Judas, who's usually darker skin, darker hair. St. Peter, who's obviously an important follower of Christ, but one that will deny him as the crucifixion comes, and then John the Evangelist. And in recent literature, some people have speculated that this indicates a marriage to Mary Magdalene, that maybe this is a female figure. But trust me on this, this image is in really, really bad shape, so it's very hard to see exactly what's going on in this image. But traditionally, there's a young figure, John the Evangelist, close to Christ, who often looks a little bit feminine because he is so young, and he was a favorite of Christ. So often we don't think of this as a woman. This is usually seen as John the Evangelist, a young follower of Christ. So the Duke of Milan eventually will be kind of kicked out of his city, even though Leonardo sells himself to the Duke as someone, or tells the Duke he can create a lot of war machines for him, in addition to doing paintings, such as we see here. Eventually the Duke of Milan will fall from power, and Leonardo makes his way back home. He makes his way back to Florence. And that's where he commissions, or that's where he's commissioned to create this work, his most famous painting, and probably one of the most famous paintings in the world, which is the Mona Lisa. So the Mona Lisa, the big question is, who is this? Who is this really? And this painting has become an object of wonder, and lots has been written about it. Is this you know, some mysterious woman who has some secret? What is with her expression? Is she smiling? Is she not smiling? Also, it was stolen in the early 20th century, so that made it very famous. In addition to that, a lot of artists have used it to create art, so we see it a lot in popular culture, and then a lot of other artists use it as inspiration. So who is she really? So what documents tell us, or what histories tell us, is that her name was Lisa Girandini, and that she was the wife of a merchant, Francesco del Giocondo. And so probably just a portrait commission where Francesco, the husband, said, you know, I would like a portrait of my wife. He's probably doing pretty well. And so this is what Leonardo creates, and it's extremely detailed. And Leonardo actually ends up keeping it with him until he dies. So that raised a lot of questions. Why would he keep this portrait with him? Why did he never deliver it to the patron? So the most likely response is that the patron, Francesco, probably didn't like it. There's a lot of things about it that are problematic in terms of the representation of a respectable woman. So starting off, we can see her hands. Her hands are in full display. And remember, those were sensual, very beautiful things that were often hidden away. things that weren't meant to be seen. She's not wearing any jewelry. So remember, a lot of portraits, it was the woman's job to demonstrate how wealthy her husband was by wearing lots and lots of jewelry. We don't see that here, so we don't know her husband is wealthy or doing well. Also, her hair is down. Most married women would have their hair up. We see a fair amount of skin on display in addition to the hands. Her expression, maybe it's kind of problematic. Maybe Leonardo's just trying to make her look pleasant, but it comes off as a little bit too available, maybe too pleasant. So most likely this portrait was rejected. We have a woman who's looking directly towards us. She's gazing out towards us in a very confrontational way, a very kind of proud woman who's up on a balcony probably. This was very common for women to be up on balconies for their portraits because they couldn't really wander the streets. So we see a very proud woman here who's directly engaging with us, which is so unusual for women in art at this time. So it's a really, really strong interaction. So Francesco probably did not like it, probably rejected it. So Leonardo, who spent all this time with it, who was so detailed in his execution, seems to have kept it with him for the rest of his life and kept working on it. So the idea here is, why did he keep it with him? Did he become obsessed with this image? Why was he so interested in it? So that's something important to think about. Why does he kind of remain interested in this work? Why does he keep it with him? And that's something that has yet to be answered. But why is the Mona Lisa so important? So it's a new example of a type of portrait that confronts the viewer and reveals more of the body. It's not just in profile and kind of hidden away. It was likely rejected for reasons of decorum. He worked on it for many years after this painting, and her expression is probably an attempt to make her seem pleasant. So most likely there's not a specific secret that she knows, but anything's possible. Alright, and then a final work to look at for Leonardo is the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. This is another kind of adventurous attempt at taking religious subject matter and switching some things around. So here I'm showing you a pre-restored version and a post-restoration version. So after cleaning off some of the layers of varnish to kind of get rid of some of that smoky effect that's become too dark. So I show you the same painting just in two different views. So the idea here is he's taking a pretty traditional piece of iconography like we saw with the Madonna of the Rocks and kind of changing it around. So typically this was a way of showing three generations: St. Anne, who's the mother of the Virgin, then the Christ child. And here Leonardo's really trying to bring that subject to life. It's a much more organic type of representation than we would normally see. The figures are kind of turning one on top of the other. They're looking at each other in a really sweet and thoughtful way. It's a very personal painting, and something that women, especially women with children, could relate to very closely. So one of the most kind of sweet parts is the idea that the Virgin is reaching towards the Christ child and trying to pull him back. The idea that he's reaching onto this sacrificial lamb, this idea that he's going to be sacrificed, that he's going to be crucified, and the Virgin's trying to pull him back, trying to keep him from being killed. So that's one of the more interesting parts. It's also been read in a more personal way, kind of a Freudian way, in the idea that Leonardo grew up with essentially two mothers. He had a biological mother. He was born to her outside of marriage, so his father was pretty well off. His mother was a relatively low status woman. He was born, lived with her for a while, and then eventually went and lived with his father and his father's wife, who was essentially his stepmother. So some people have read it more personally in that you have these two mothers with a one child, but most likely what Leonardo is trying to do is to take that really like serious, stiff, religious imagery and infuse it with a more organic and personal quality, and infuse kind of all his chiaroscuro, his shadowing techniques, including things like atmospheric perspective to give dimension. So Leonardo really was a master at Renaissance techniques of creating nice, stable compositions, harmonious compositions, but infusing them with his own flair and making them look very, very natural.